Hi folks, welcome to this video on practice methods. So you might have seen another video called practice types or types of practice. That's to do with how do you coach individual skills and how might we be able to break skills down or not be able to break skills down in order to teach them in parts or teach them as a whole. This thing, practice methods, is about organising a session. Let's say you've got an hour and a half, and you want to work on a particular skill or tactic or something like that. Practice methods is how would you structure that hour or hour and a half. So what we're going to look at are definitions of each of these, and then pros and cons and when and where you would use each practice method. Put simply, a massed practice session is a session that has no breaks. So if you have got someone for 60 minutes or 90 minutes, what you're going to do is you're going to work them for 60 or 90 minutes without giving them any breaks. Now, in your head, that might or might not be already ringing some pros and some cons. You know, it's very good for improving fitness, for example, but the risk of injury or fatigue-related injury is very, very high. You know, things like that. That's what we're going to explore in a couple of minutes. But a mass practice session is you're working on skills or tactics or something like that, and you're working that full time that you have them for, no breaks. So in contrast to that, distributed practice is where we have a session with breaks. So you've got them for that 60 or 90 minutes, and we're going to do drill number 1 for 20 minutes, then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute break, then we'll do drill 2 for another 20 minutes, 5 to 10 minute break, and then we're going to finish with a condition game. That might be something that you're a little bit more used to, it might not be, but you distribute the drills with breaks in between. Varied practice is where we have a session with lots of different drills. And like I put there, the session based on lots of variety and drills with different layouts. Now, something I need to make clear to you, that doesn't mean in that session we do a bit of shooting, a bit of passing, a bit of dribbling. We're still looking at one skill. It might be passing. But within that session, there are lots of different drills. We're not just doing the same 10 by 10 yard, pass to your partner with your left foot, keep it going, in step, We're doing maybe a bit of that to start with, but then bringing in a 2v1 situation, then bringing in a 3v2 situation, then bringing in some cones and markers where we've got to ping long balls and run onto a pass, and we're passing with the inside of the foot and the outside of the foot, you're passing with both feet. There are lots of variety. You're not just doing the same drill over and over again. Straight away in your head, you'd be thinking, well, that's very sport specific. That's a big point. It develops a lot of decision making. If you're thinking back to your skill classification, that's very good for open skills. These are the kind of things that we're going to look at in a second. And then finally, in contrast to that, you've got fixed practice, which is the exact opposite of varied practice. You're just going to repeat the same drill over and over again. Think about someone doing a backhand serve in badminton. What you would basically do with them is say, right, for this 45 minutes or an hour, there's a bucket of shuttlecocks and there's a little target on the other side of the court. I just want you to do backhand serve after backhand serve after backhand serve and see how many times you can hit that target that I've placed there. And they don't do anything else in that session. And again, that's got its pros and cons, and we're going to look at the pros and cons of each of these practice methods now. So with mass practice first, again, just a quick reminder, that is no breaks. We're not doing any breaks in this session. We're working for an hour or an hour and a half non-stop. The question is often, what would influence your decision to use a massed practice session? They could then say something a little bit different. What are the advantages or disadvantages of each? What we've got to do is look at the factors that would influence your decision. And then if that question comes up on advantages and disadvantages, that's going to be your call in the exam to analyse the question and break it down and use these. So let's deal with the reasons or the factors that would influence your decision to use a mass practice session. So firstly, what would be key criteria number 1 for doing a mass practice session? It's got to be autonomous learners, high ability learners, because they've got to be able to cope with the demands of a practice session without any breaks in it. Okay, secondly, it develops high fitness levels doing a mass practice session, a session without any breaks. But also, we could also say, in order to do a mass practice session, you need quite high fitness levels in the first place, or else you're not going to be able to last the session. Mass practice is, again, only really going to be used if we're doing simple skills. Even if you are super fit, even if you have got autonomous learners, you are still going to get tired doing a session without any breaks. And if you get tired, you're going to make mistakes. So it's best to only do mass practice sessions when the skills are relatively simple in the first place to minimise the amount of mistakes that your performers are going to make. Massed practice is also great if you haven't got much time. So it's a very time efficient way to coach. If I've got an hour, we are doing an hour. If I have breaks in there, I could end up wasting 15, 20 minutes of the hour on breaks. So if I've got a lot to do in a set amount of time, mass practice, is probably the way forward for that. Finally, really on this, it's only really best to use mass practice when there's relatively low danger in the session that you're doing. As I said, you could be super fit, they could be autonomous, but they are still going to get tired during this session. If you get tired, you start to make mistakes. And as you make mistakes, the danger increases. So we need to really be doing this with low danger or, low risk tasks to start with. So that's what would influence your decision to use a massed practice session. Okay, like I said, if the question came up on advantages and disadvantages, you'd then have to use these ideas to come up with your answer. It's an advantage to use it with autonomous learners, but it's a disadvantage to use with cognitive learners. It's an advantage to use it with simple skills, but it's a disadvantage to use it with complex skills. So we've just got to be able to use these ideas and then apply them to the question that we get. Right then, so in opposition to a mass practice session, we've now got a distributed practice session, and that's a session with breaks. Now, as you might expect, this is kind of going to be the opposite criteria to a mass practice session. And it is, so let's have a look at it. As you might expect now, distributed practice is great for cognitive learners. Okay? They are beginners, so they're going to need regular breaks so they can understand what they've just done and move on, understand what they're doing next. What do those breaks give cognitive learners? They give them a chance for you to give them feedback, to discuss and Q&A them and see if they have understood everything that they need to understand before they move on to the next drill. Distributed practice sessions are also best for less fit or lower fit individuals, okay? They're a great starting point for people like that. Don't get me wrong, you want to improve their fitness and you'll ultimately try and maybe build up to a mass practice session in some circumstances, but what would influence your decision to set up a distributed practice? It would be if their fitness levels are quite low. As you would expect with a cognitive learner, you would expect them to have quite low fitness levels because they're new to the sport. But you might also want to set up a distributed session if the skill is quite complex. Why? Well, that's going to give you breaks so that you can teach a bit, have a break and have a discussion with the group. What did you understand by that? Have you got everything that you needed to from that little bit before we then move on to the next one? So that, again, that feedback thing comes into it as well. If it's a complex skill, we can coach it bit by bit and have breaks and intervals to have feedback and have discussions to make sure that we're all making progress and we're all happy with what we're doing. However, as you'd expect, it's quite a time-consuming method. Like I said, if you've got an hour and you're having breaks every 15 minutes, you're going to lose 10, 15 minutes of that session to breaks. So you're going to have more time available than what you would to cover the drills. Okay, so it's quite a time-consuming method. And finally then, it's a good session to use if there is potential danger, if there is risk in this session, because you can then control the risk by doing a bit, having a break, make sure everyone recovers, gets over their fatigue, make sure everyone understands what they've done and what they need to do in the next one, and then move it on again. So it's a very, very good method for controlling danger within a session. Right, so varied practice then. Varied, as you might expect, means things like doing different drills, okay? Now the point here is I might be working on the same skill. I might still be working on passing, but I'm not just going to do the same passing drill for the entire session. I'm going to vary the drills, get a little bit of variability in there as well. Why is that advantageous? It allows me to make training very competition specific. So take a passing drill. I could do a box drill, me passing to you, but that's not very match specific. If I then vary the drill by bringing in a 2v1, that is going to then allow me to bring a defender in, figure out a way to get around a defender, and that's going to improve the competition element of the practice. It's also a very good way to allow my performers on how to adapt to skill, what we call open skills. Remember, open skills are open to the environment. Someone can come and close you down. Someone can backtrack. Someone can mark the play that you're about to pass to in an open environment. So for open skills, you've got to learn how to adapt them to suit the needs of the situation, and that's what varied practice allows you to do. I suppose the final thing you can say on it is it mimics real life. If you're doing lots of variety in there, that's exactly what you'd expect to do in a competition. Be able to apply the skills to various situations, variety of opponents, variety of spaces, angles, distances, things like that. And it definitely does link to schema theory. So if you've already done the schema theory video, what is schema theory? How do we learn? What we're talking about there is variety of practice, okay? So if I have to adapt a skill to suit a certain situation, I am using schema theory. So these two definitely go hand in hand, okay? So finally then, fixed practice, like we said, the opposite of varied practice. The phrase they love associated with this is it promotes over-learning. In other words, if you're going to do, as I said earlier on in this video, that backhand serve in badminton for 45 minutes, by the end of that session, you're going to have a very good grasp of that technique. So you're going to really learn that particular technique well. As a result, it's a great technique if you are a beginner or you've got beginners or i.e. cognitive learners, really, really good for them. You want them to get a good grasp of it. Varied practice. If you're chopping and changing the drills before they're ready, they're going to get lost. So if I've got a beginner on a particular skill, it might be good to do a bit of fixed practice. Really good for closed skills. So really good for skills where the environment's fixed. Very few decisions have to be made. Low complexity skills as well. Simple skills, sorry. So if there is a particular technique you want to learn, because it's a closed environment, because they're not going to have to make decisions on court, on track, whatever it is, you can really get that into them and instill that into them by using a lot of fixed practice. However, board.com, doing the same thing for an entire session is going to be really, really boring. So it's not going to be great in terms of getting them passionate about your sport, particularly if they are beginners. And that's why I would say, we've said this is good for beginners. In some ways it is, in some ways it's not so great. So it's getting that balance right. It's obviously not a very good technique for developing decision making because they're not having to make any decisions. They're just repeating the same action over and over again. So if you want thinkers, if you want people who can think on the feet quickly and make changes where they think they need to make changes in your sport, by doing a lot of fixed practice, you are not going to develop that. You're going to develop doers as opposed to thinkers. It's also not very sports specific for many sports because of the fact that in the vast majority of sports, you've got to make decisions, you've got to think. So it's lacking that sports specificity. So as you can see, there are all pros and cons to each of these practice methods. What I'm going to quickly finish on now is something that I think should help you out when you're looking at this topic, practice methods, but also when you're looking at practice types, whole part, whole, things like that. These two are very similar to each other, and this last little screen hopefully will help you when answering a question or questions on this topic. So these two sections, types of practice that we've got here and methods of delivery, are closely linked because obviously when you're looking at coaching or teaching an individual skill, is that skill best to do whole, or progressive part? And then equally, you're going to coach that skill within a session. So how are you going to deliver that session? Is it going to be massed, distributed, varied, fixed? So these, although they are separate topics, of course they are linked. If you are a coach, you've got to take both into consideration. Now, as I just said previously, there are a few things that we can apply to both of these types of practice and methods of delivery. You could get a question saying, which type of practice would you use in a given situation, or what would influence your decision to use whole versus whole part whole type of practice? What would influence your decision to do a massed practice session over a distributed practice session? So there are certain things that we can use that should have become clear over the course of those little mind maps that we did. So let's have a look. Now, this is one of those lists where if you just think about it and take your time, this will gradually start to sink in and it'll be absolutely fine. What we've got here, for example, you could use all of these to answer a question on any of these topics. For example, ability of performer. Let's say you've got a high ability level. Your performers in your group are very skilled, very experienced performers. That might mean that you would mainly just do whole practice because they can handle lots of information. They don't need things to be broken down. However, you might have a group of beginners, opposite end of the spectrum, where you really need to do part, whole, progressive part practice because you need to break those skills down so you can drip feed information to them in bite-sized chunks. Equally, if I've got high ability, I might do massed practice. They don't need breaks. Okay, they're fit, they're strong, they don't need as much feedback. Whereas if I've got low ability, I might use distributed practice sessions where I can give them lots of breaks, lots of chance for feedback, okay? And it's a case of thinking about what these factors mean and how they might influence what you've got here. Ages of performance, again, quite simple. If they're young, I'll use one of the part practices, just because I need to break it down for them. If they're old, I'll use the whole practice, because they'll probably be able to handle large pieces of information. If they're young, they're probably not quite so good at it, so I might have to do a lot of fixed practice to make sure that they'll learn the skill quite quickly. However, pros and cons, that's quite boring for young people, and you might need to change it. This is what you might have to do in the exam. What are the pros and cons? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Complexity of the skill. How difficult is the skill? If it's really complex, break it down to one of the part practices. If it's quite simple, whole practice. Equally, complexity of skill, lots of breaks in your session. Low complexity, it's quite a simple skill, you can just rattle through without giving them much breaks. You can get lots of variety if it's a simple skill, because you can change the drills quite quickly. If it's quite a complex skill, we might have to keep on the same skill over and over again, the same drill, to make sure they've got it. Time available, it's very time consuming, breaking all these skills down. So if I've not got much time, whole practice. If I've got lots of time, one of the part practice methods. Lots of time, distributed, varied, get variety in there, get breaks in there. If I've not got much time available, masked, no breaks, fix the drill so we're not wasting time setting up, extra drills in between, things like that. Danger involved, high danger, get the skill broken down. Low danger, teach it as a whole. High danger, get lots of breaks in there so they're not fatigued. If it's low danger, you can just, you don't matter if they're a little bit tired, there shouldn't be any extra risk. It's just a case of going through these. The group size as well, if I'm breaking it down for one performer, I've got to break it down for them all. So large group sizes, that is very time consuming. So I might do whole practice with a big group. I might do one of the part methods with a smaller group where I can work on individual weaknesses and techniques. So it's a case of using each of these, as we've done previously in these mind maps, and thinking, how would it affect? There isn't no right or wrong, well, there are right and wrong answers, but sometimes you'll be, oh, is it one or the other? Put them both down, justify, say why you're thinking that. That's what you've got to do on these exam questions. Hope you found this video useful, folks.